There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive on a hard day or after a fight or in the middle of a sleepless night. It arrives quietly, on a Tuesday, while you're doing something ordinary, stirring a pot, folding laundry, standing at a window, watching rain. And then one morning you look up and you realize you can't remember the last time someone in your own home looked you in the eye and asked, "How are you really?" Not, "Did you pay the electric bill?" Not, "What's for dinner?" Not, "Mom, have you seen my keys?" Just, "How are you?" There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who need you, and slowly, quietly, without anyone meaning to, forgetting that you're a person at all. I know that loneliness. I lived inside it for 4 years before I even had a name for it. My name is Gloria Washington. I am 63 years old. I am a retired school teacher. I am a widow. I am a mother and a grandmother. I have lived in the same house on Peachtree Lane in Atlanta, Georgia for 34 years. And one morning, standing in my own kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning, I looked into the dark reflection of the window above the sink, and I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. It wasn't the gray hair. I earned every strand of that. It wasn't the lines around my eyes. Ronald used to say those were just proof that I'd laughed enough. It was the eyes themselves. Empty, distant, like someone who had stopped existing a long time ago and just hadn't sat down yet. I stood there with flour on my hands and cornbread batter in a bowl, and I said out loud to nobody, "That's not tiredness. That's disappearing." And somewhere underneath the quiet of that kitchen, underneath the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a mockingbird starting up outside, I heard the truth I had been out running for 4 years settle into my chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. I had not disappeared all at once. I had disappeared one small thing at a time. Let me tell you how it started. You need to understand what the house was before you can understand what was taken. The house on Peachtree Lane was not a grand house. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that was too small by modern standards, and a back porch that tilted slightly to the left because Ronald kept saying he'd fix it and never quite got around to it. The floors were original hardwood scratched in all the places where life had happened. The front door stuck in humid weather. The water pressure in the upstairs shower was never quite right. But that house had a feeling. Ronald and I bought it in 1989, the year after we got married. We were 26 years old, and we had $11,000 saved between us, and we thought we were the richest people in Atlanta. We signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon, and that night we sat on the bare floor of the empty living room, no furniture, not even a lamp, and we ate cold fried chicken out of a paper bag, and we talked about everything we were going to do. "This is ours, Gloria," Ronald said, and the way he said it, quiet, certain, like he was saying something sacred, I felt it in my bones. This is ours. 30 years of mortgage payments. 30 years of leaky faucets and repainting the shutters and replacing the water heater twice. 30 years of Christmases and arguments and Sunday dinners and the particular kind of love that only grows in a place where people have weathered things together. By the time I retired from teaching in 2018, that house was not just a structure. It was alive with everything that had ever happened inside it. There were 5 things about that house that I loved most. The first was the garden out back. I had been tending that garden for 25 years. Collard greens along the east fence, which my mother had taught me to grow and season. Tomatoes in 3 raised beds Ronald built me for our 10th anniversary. Herbs along the south wall, thyme sage, and a sprawling rosemary bush that Ronald had brought home as a seedling from a trip to Savannah in 1995. "Found it at a little market near the river," he'd said, holding it out to me in both hands like an offering. "Thought it looked like something you'd like." That rosemary had been growing in my garden for 28 years. I never cut it back as far as I should have. I couldn't bring myself to. It had outlived the man who gave it to me, and there was something about that I wasn't ready to let go of. The second was the radio in the kitchen. It was an old thing, a countertop radio with a dial that clicked when you turned it, the kind you can't find in stores anymore. Ronald had bought it at a yard sale in 1997 for $3 and declared it a treasure. Every Sunday morning since then, I tuned it to the gospel station that broadcast out of a little church over in Decatur. Aretha Franklin, Mahalia Jackson, the Clark sisters. The music would come up slow and warm while the biscuits were in the oven and the kitchen filled with light, and for that hour every week I felt like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. The third was the armchair by the front window, navy blue, a little worn at the armrests. I had bought it at a consignment shop in 2016, the year after Ronald passed, because the house had felt too hollow, and I needed something solid, and mine in the living room. I sat in that chair every evening after dinner. I read there. I prayed there. I watched the light change on Peachtree Lane through the seasons, the dogwoods blooming pink in March, the heat shimmering off the asphalt in July, the sweet gums turning rust and amber in October. That chair was where I went when I needed to remember who I was. The fourth was the cornbread. My mother's recipe written in her handwriting on an index card so old the edges had gone soft. Her mother had made it before her. I had made it my whole adult life. I knew the recipe by heart had for decades, but I still got out that index card every time because seeing her handwriting made her feel close. The fifth was Ronald's photograph on the mantelpiece, taken in the summer of 1991. He was standing on a riverbank somewhere in South Carolina, cane fishing rod in hand, grinning at the camera, the way he only grinned when he thought nobody was paying attention. The sun was behind him, and it caught the edges of him in gold. He looked like a man who had everything he needed. I talked to that photograph more than I admitted to anyone. These were the things I loved most about my life in the years before. And then there was Darlene. Darlene came into the world on a rainy night in November of 1985, and from the moment they placed her in my arms, I understood for the first time that it was possible to love something so completely that you stopped being afraid of anything. She was small and furious and perfect, and I looked at her face, that scrunched, indignant newborn face, and thought, whatever you need, I will find a way. I spent the next 38 years keeping that promise. I worked double shifts in the summers so she could go to dance camp. I ate cereal for dinner for a month the spring of her junior year so she could have the prom dress she wanted, the blue one floor length with beading at the neckline. I drove her to choir auditions at 6 in the morning. I sat with her through a miscarriage she didn't tell anyone else about. I held her hand in the delivery room when Jordan was born because Travis had gone pale and needed to sit down. When Ronald died in 2015, I did not let myself fall apart in front of her. She needed me steady. So I was steady. I want you to understand this. I didn't do those things to earn anything. I did them because she was my daughter, and I loved her, and love to me had always meant showing up with your whole self, holding nothing back. The problem, the thing I didn't understand until much too late, was that I had spent so long giving everything I had that I had quietly, without noticing, given away myself. There's a photograph from Darlene's college graduation, May 2007. She's standing in her cap and gown diploma in hand, smiling directly into the camera with everything she had ahead of her. I am in the photograph too, standing just slightly to the left, half in the frame, smiling at her instead of the camera. I have looked at that photograph 100 times over the years and thought it was a picture of her achievement, her moment, her future. It wasn't until much later that I understood what else it was. It was the earliest evidence of a habit I hadn't even noticed I was forming, standing at the edge of my own life so someone else could have the center. In the spring of 2019, Darlene called me on a Sunday afternoon. She and Travis had both been laid off. The restaurant group he managed had downsized, and the marketing firm where she worked had done a round of cuts. They had 2 kids, a lease coming up for renewal, and a savings account that wouldn't last 3 months. "We just need some time to get back on our feet, Mama," she said. "Just until we figure things out." "Come home," I said, without hesitation, without conditions. This is what the house is for. Jordan was 11 that spring. Lily was 7. They came through my front door carrying backpacks and stuffed animals, and that particular energy that children carry when they don't fully understand that something has gone wrong. Jordan went straight for the kitchen, hunting for snacks. Lily ran to me and wrapped her arms around my legs. "Grandma's house smells like cornbread," she said, like this was the most wonderful thing she had ever noticed. I held her small, warm head against me, and I thought, yes, this is right. This is what family means. I gave Darlene and Travis the master bedroom. I took the smaller room at the end of the hall. I bought a bunk bed for Jordan and Lily to share. I stocked the refrigerator and reorganized the pantry and made a list of all the things the kids liked to eat. I was happy. I want to be clear about that because it matters. In the beginning, I was genuinely completely happy. I didn't know that spring that I was standing at the beginning of something. I didn't know that 4 years later, I would be standing in the dark of my own kitchen in the early morning, looking at a stranger in the window glass, trying to remember when I had stopped being a person in my own home. I didn't know it yet, but I would learn. They didn't take everything at once. That's the thing nobody tells you about losing yourself inside your own family. It doesn't happen in a single terrible moment that you can point to later and say, there, that's when it changed. There's no villain standing in a doorway, no dramatic confrontation, no obvious line crossed. It happens the way a shoreline erodes, one wave at a time, each one small enough to ignore, until one day you look up and realize the land you were standing on is simply gone. It started with the radio. 3 weeks after Darlene and her family moved in, I came downstairs on a Sunday morning to start breakfast. I reached over and turned the dial to my gospel station the way I had done every Sunday for 22 years. Travis came into the kitchen 10 minutes later, still in his undershirt, and without a word, without even glancing at me, reached past my shoulder and changed the station to something with a heavy bass line and a lot of noise. Then he opened the refrigerator and stood there staring into it. I stood at the stove with a spatula in my hand, and I told myself it's just a radio station. He probably didn't even think about it. He's not a bad man, he just didn't think. So I didn't say anything. I made breakfast in silence while the music I didn't choose filled my kitchen, and I told myself I was being gracious, flexible, the kind of mother-in-law who doesn't make trouble over small things. I didn't understand yet that small things were all it was ever going to be. Small things one after another until there was nothing left. Ronald and I had eaten at that table together for 26 years. It was where we talked, really talked, not the kind of half-listening that happens in front of a television, but the kind of talking where you look at each other and say the things that matter. It was where we'd told Darlene she was going to be a big sister the pregnancy we lost at 14 weeks. It was where Ronald had sat across from me the morning after his diagnosis and taken both my hands in his and said, "Whatever happens, Gloria, we're going to be all right." 6 weeks after they moved in, Darlene started letting the kids eat on the couch in front of the TV. "It's just easier," she said. "They eat better when they're distracted." Within a month, nobody was eating at the table anymore. It became a place to drop bags, stack mail, leave things that didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't say anything. I ate my meals alone at the end of it at the chair I'd always sat in with the rest of the surface buried under other people's things. Then came the rosemary. It was an October afternoon, clear and cool, the kind of fall day that makes Atlanta feel like a gift. I was inside folding laundry when I heard the crunch, a low, heavy sound from the backyard. I looked out the window to see Travis backing his truck up along the side fence to unload some equipment he'd borrowed from a friend. The rosemary bush, Ronald's rosemary 24 years old, was crushed flat. Branches snapped. The smell of it hit me even through the closed window, sharp and green and wild, the way it smelled when you brushed against it on a warm day. Travis got out, looked at what he'd done, and called inside. "Hey, Gloria, I think I clipped some of your plants back there. Sorry about that." Then he went back to unloading his truck. I stood at the laundry room window, and I did not move for a long time. That evening, after everyone had gone inside, I went out to the garden with a flashlight, and I knelt in the dirt and gathered every piece of that rosemary I could find. The branches that hadn't broken completely. The sprigs that still had some green in them. I laid them out on the potting bench, and I tried to figure out what could be saved. Very little could be saved. I stayed out there longer than I needed to, not because I thought I could fix it, but because I wasn't ready to go back inside yet where the radio was playing too loud, and someone else's shoes were by my front door, and the table where Ronald had held my hands was buried under a week's worth of other people's mail. These are small things, I told myself, kneeling in the cold dirt. Family is more important than a rosemary bush. I believed that. What I didn't understand yet was that small things stacked high enough can bury a person alive. He brought it up on a Sunday in March, casual, the way he always brought things up as if the decision had already been made, and he was just informing me of the details. We were thinking, he said, leaning against the kitchen counter with his coffee, that it might make more sense for you to take the smaller room. You'd have everything you need in there, and it's closer to the bathroom in the hall. Better for you. Better for you. I had slept in the master bedroom for 30 years. Ronald had built the closet shelving in there himself, fitted to exactly how I organized my things. The window looked out over the backyard where the garden was. In the mornings, the light came in at an angle that had woken me gently every day since 1989. But there were 4 of them, and 1 of me. And Travis was right that the smaller room had a closer bathroom, and I didn't want to be difficult. I moved my things on a Tuesday. I took Ronald's photograph. I took the mirror from the wall. I left everything else, the closet shelving, the curtains, the 30 years of mornings. I told myself it was just a room. I told myself that a lot in those days. It's just a room. It's just a radio station. It's just rosemary. It's just a table. Darlene came to me in April, quiet, a little embarrassed the way she used to look as a teenager when she needed something she hadn't earned. Travis's truck needed a repair they hadn't budgeted for. $4,000. We'll pay you back in 3 months, Mama. I promise. I wrote the check without hesitating. Of course I did. That's what you do. 3 months passed, then 6, then a year. The $4,000 was never mentioned again. I didn't mention it either. I told myself that keeping count was an unloving thing to do, that money given to your child in need was not a loan, it was love in a practical form. I told myself a lot of things in those days to make the truth easier to live with. Jordan and Lily had been staying up past 10 o'clock on school nights, and I could see it in them. The tiredness, the irritability, the way Jordan was struggling to focus when he tried to do his homework at the kitchen table. I knew this because I had been a school teacher for 34 years, and I knew what a tired child looked like. One evening I said gently to Darlene, "Baby, I think the kids might need an earlier bedtime. They seem worn out." Darlene looked up from her phone. "Mom," she said, "please don't tell me how to raise my kids." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you say something to someone who has overstepped firmly with a slight edge of impatience, the way you'd correct someone who didn't know their place. I went to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed, the smaller bed in the smaller room, and I looked at Ronald's photograph on the nightstand. "Am I wrong?" I whispered. But I noticed sitting there in the quiet of that small room that I had asked Ronald instead of trusting myself. That I needed permission from a man in a photograph to believe that what I had seen was real. That was the first time I understood, without quite being able to say it, something is happening here that is not right. You can lose a radio station. You can lose a bedroom. You can lose money. These are things you can name, things you can point to, things that exist in the physical world. What I lost in the 3rd year was harder to name. I lost my voice in my own house. I overheard Jordan on the phone one afternoon. He was in the living room talking to a friend, the easy, careless way teenagers talk when they think they're alone. "Nah, I can't. The old lady upstairs is probably going to want me to do something." I was standing in the hallway. He didn't know I was there. I walked to the kitchen. I filled a glass of water. I stood at the sink and drank it slowly. I had held that boy's head against my chest for 3 days when he had pneumonia at age 4, singing to him until his fever broke. I had driven him to his first middle school dance. I had sat with him at this very kitchen table doing multiplication tables until he finally got them. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't know how to say it in a way that wouldn't make things harder. So I let it go the way I had learned to let everything go. But something inside me got a little quieter that day, a little smaller. My 61st birthday was March 14th. I didn't say anything about it in the days leading up to it. I didn't put it on the calendar in the kitchen. I didn't want to make anyone feel obligated. The day itself was a Tuesday. Darlene and Travis had plans with friends that evening, a birthday dinner for someone from Travis's old job. They mentioned it at breakfast, not connecting it to the date. Jordan gave me a card he'd made himself construction paper and markers, a drawing of what I think was meant to be a flower. "Happy birthday, Grandma," it said inside in his careful teenage handwriting. "You are a good grandma." Lily climbed into my lap after school and hugged me for a long time without saying why. That was all. That evening I baked a pan of cornbread. My mother's recipe, the card in her handwriting. I made a small pot of soup. I set one place at the dining room table, pushing aside the stacked mail and Lily's art projects to make room, and I sat down alone and ate my birthday dinner. And then, because I was alone and no one could hear me, I sang happy birthday to myself. Quietly, just the first verse. In the empty dining room of my own house, surrounded by other people's things. And the worst part wasn't the loneliness. I found them on a Thursday afternoon in November while I was reorganizing the small desk in my room. A folder. Bank statements for the account I had opened for household expenses. The account I'd asked Darlene to manage since I didn't always remember to transfer money before bills came due. I had trusted her with access 18 months earlier and hadn't looked closely at it since. I sat down on the edge of my bed and I opened the folder. I went through the statements page by page. By the time I reached the last page, my hands were completely still, not trembling still, the way your body goes when it has received something too large to process in motion. $23,400. Withdrawn over 18 months. Not the $4,000 for the truck repair, though that was in there. Not groceries, not utility bills, not the children's school supplies. A resort in Florida. A weekend in February. A casino withdrawal in March. Another in July. A boutique I had never heard of. 3 visits in 1 month. A spa. A weekend hotel in Savannah. Ronald had worked double shifts for 20 years to save the money that had been in those accounts. He had driven a truck with 200,000 miles on it because we had things to save for. He had packed his lunch every day for a decade. He had done all of that, and we had done it together because we believed in building something that would last. I sat on the edge of my bed in my small borrowed room, and I looked at those numbers, and I thought about all the mornings Ronald had gotten up before sunrise. All the evenings he'd come home tired in a way that lived in his shoulders and the way he lowered himself into a chair. And then I thought about Darlene, my daughter, my whole heart, the little girl in the blue dress, the young woman I had eaten cereal for dinner for so she could have the prom dress she wanted. Not stolen by a stranger, I thought. Taken by our daughter. I didn't cry. I don't know why. I had expected to cry. Instead, I sat very still for a long time and I listened to the sounds of the house around me, the television from downstairs, Lily laughing at something Travis's truck in the driveway, and I felt something shift deep inside me. Something that had been bent for a long time beginning very slowly to straighten. I put the folder in the back of my closet behind my winter coats. I wasn't ready yet, but I was getting there. I came home from a doctor's appointment, just a routine checkup, nothing serious, and walked into the living room, and the navy blue armchair was not there. In its place was a large leather recliner, dark brown still with a small sticker on the armrest from wherever Travis had bought it. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen and I said carefully, "Travis, what happened to my armchair?" He looked up from his phone. "Oh yeah, I sold it. It was looking pretty worn, was bringing the room down. Got a good deal on that recliner. It's really comfortable. You'll like it." He went back to his phone. I turned around and walked back to my room. I sat down on my bed. I looked at Ronald's photograph. That chair was where I had read every book I'd read in the last 6 years. Where I had prayed. Where I had watched the seasons change on Peachtree Lane. Where I had gone every single evening to remember who I was. Travis had sold it, without asking. without mentioning it, without a thought that it might have mattered to me. And the worst part, the part that scared me more than the chair, more than the money, more than any of it, was that I was not surprised. I had become, without fully realizing it, a woman whose things could be sold out from under her, a woman who could be moved from room to room, a woman whose station could be changed, whose garden could be crushed, whose birthday could be forgotten, a woman who had made herself so quiet, so small, so undemanding that the people living in her house had simply stopped factoring her into their decisions. When did I become furniture, I thought. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. It was a Saturday morning in the fall of 2022. I was in the back garden doing what I always did when I needed to think, tending the small patch of herbs I'd managed to keep alive along the south wall. The kitchen window above me was open. I could hear the sounds of the house drifting out, the television, the kids, the ordinary noise of a Saturday morning. Then I heard Darlene's voice. She was on the phone. She had come into the kitchen not knowing I was just outside the open window, and she was talking the way people talk when they believe they are alone. I stayed still. I don't know why. Some instinct. Travis actually found a place not too far from here, about 40 minutes out. It's a senior living community, has a memory care unit and everything. A pause. Her friend was talking. No, she's fine mentally. She's sharp as ever. But you know how it is. It would just be easier, and we could finally have the house to ourselves. Another pause. The house is still in her name, obviously. But Travis talked to someone. Apparently, there are legal options when a family is concerned about an elderly parent's ability to manage their affairs. There are ways. Her voice drifted as she moved deeper into the kitchen. I stood in the garden. I looked down at the small rosemary plant I had started from seed 8 months ago, the one I'd grown to replace what Travis's truck had destroyed. It was about 4 inches tall, fragile still, but alive. I kept watering. I watered the rosemary. I watered the herbs along the wall. I watered the tomato plants that were done for the season, but that I hadn't pulled up yet. I watered everything in that garden slowly and thoroughly before I turned off the hose and coiled it back on the hook. Then I went inside. I watered every plant in that garden before I allowed myself to feel what I'd just heard. Because I knew if I stopped moving, I would fall down and not get back up. It was a dinner party. 8 people around my dining room table, Darlene's friends, Travis's colleague and his wife, a couple from their gym. Darlene had spent 2 days preparing, and she had done it beautifully. The table was set with linens I didn't recognize. There were candles. There was wine. I had not been told about the dinner party until the afternoon it happened. I sat at the end of the table in my chair, the only seat left by the time I understood what was happening, and I tried to be a good guest at my own dinner table. I was telling a story about a student I'd had years ago, a little boy who had been terrified of reading, and who by the end of 3rd grade was devouring chapter books. It was a good story. It had a good ending. I was partway through it when Darlene laughed lightly and touched the arm of the woman next to her. "Sorry," she said in the warm, easy voice she used with people she wanted to impress. "Mom gets a little confused sometimes about when things happened. Don't mind her." I sat at the end of the table. My mouth was still open slightly, the end of my story still waiting inside it. I closed my mouth. I picked up my fork. I looked down at my plate. Nobody looked at me. Not with cruelty. They simply looked away. The way you look away from something that doesn't require your attention. She didn't call me a liar in front of her friends. She did something worse. She made me disappear and made everyone laugh while doing it. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I was in my room sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark. I heard a small knock. Lily stood in the doorway in her pajamas. She was holding a folded piece of paper. "Grandma, can I show you something?" She came in and sat beside me on the bed and handed me the paper. It was a school assignment. I could see the printed heading at the top. "Describe a hero. Use specific details and examples." Lily had written 2 pages in her 11-year-old handwriting, the letters still working out their final shapes. She had written about me. She wrote about the cornbread. She wrote about the time I sat with her all night when she was sick and made up stories about a rabbit named Theodore who had very strong opinions about carrots. She wrote about the garden and how I had taught her that rosemary grew back even when you thought it was gone. And at the bottom of the second page, in a sentence that sat alone like it had needed its own space, she had written, "My grandma is the bravest person I know." But I think she forgot that she's allowed to be brave for herself, too. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I folded the paper carefully along its original creases, and I held it in both hands in my lap, and I sat with it for a long time. Lily had fallen asleep against my arm. I didn't move her. I sat in the dark with her warm weight against me and her essay in my hands, and I thought about what it meant that an 11-year-old could see what I had spent 4 years refusing to. That night, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I slept without waking. Something had shifted. Something was coming. It was a Wednesday. Not a significant Wednesday. Not an anniversary. Not a holiday. Not any kind of day that would later make sense as the day things changed. Just an ordinary Wednesday in March, gray and cool, the kind of morning that arrives without announcement and asks nothing of you. I woke at 5 o'clock the way I always did. Old habit from 34 years of being at school by 7:30. My body had never unlearned it even in retirement. Even now, 5 years into other people living in my house, I still rose in the dark and went downstairs while everyone else slept. I went to the kitchen. I got out my mother's index card and I started the cornbread, measuring the cornmeal, the flour, the buttermilk, the way my hands had done 1,000 times. The routine of it was the most reliable thing in my life. When everything else had shifted and rearranged itself around me, the cornbread stayed the same. Same card, same handwriting, same motions. I reached over to turn on the radio. The station it landed on was not my gospel station. It hadn't been my gospel station in 4 years. I turned the dial slowly, looking for it, and then I don't know why on that particular morning I stopped. I just stopped. I put my hand back on the counter, and I stood there in the silence, and I thought I haven't heard Mahalia Jackson on a Sunday morning in 4 years. I stopped looking for the station so long ago I can't even remember deciding to stop. I stood there and I tried to remember the last Sunday I had stood in this kitchen with gospel music filling the room and biscuits in the oven, and that feeling, that particular irreplaceable feeling that everything was as it should be. I couldn't remember. The memory was there somewhere, but it was far away behind too many other mornings. Behind too many mornings of being quiet, of stepping aside, of letting things go. I started the cornbread. My hands moved. The batter came together. 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Darlene came through the kitchen in her robe phone in her hand, a mug of coffee she'd already made. She'd bought a single-serve machine for the counter, because the pot I made in the mornings was apparently not how she liked it. She moved through the kitchen the way she always did, efficiently focused on her phone somewhere else in her mind before she'd even arrived. "Good morning, baby," I said. She didn't answer. Not cruelly. Not with intention. She simply didn't hear me or didn't register me the way you don't register a piece of furniture when you walk past it. She opened the refrigerator, got out the oat milk she kept on the top shelf, added some to her coffee, and walked back toward the hallway. I watched her go. My daughter, 38 years old. I knew the back of that head when it was covered in soft baby hair that smelled like milk and warmth. I knew the way those shoulders moved. She carried tension in her right shoulder, the way Ronald had slightly higher than the left. She walked out of the kitchen without looking at me, and something inside me, something that had been bending for 4 years under the weight of small surrenders, went very, very quiet. Not angry, not hurt exactly. Something beyond hurt. Something that had finished with hurt and arrived somewhere else entirely. When did I become something you walk past? I stood at the counter with the cornbread in the oven, and I let myself think. Really think without rushing past it, without softening it into something easier about what my life had become. I thought, when did I become furniture? I'm not asking for gratitude. Lord knows I didn't raise her for gratitude. I raised her to be strong and to move through the world with her head up. I didn't do the things I did so she'd spend her life thanking me for them. But I am asking, when did good morning become something you say to a wall? Ronald used to say I had the loudest laugh in any room we walked into. He said it like it was one of his favorite things about me, that I couldn't contain it, that it came out of me whether I meant it to or not. He said it embarrassed him sometimes at fancy restaurants or quiet events, and that he loved it anyway. When was the last time I laughed like that? Not the polite laugh I'd been doing for 4 years, the one I deployed at the dinner table to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to make everyone comfortable. Not that one. The real one. The one that came from somewhere deep and surprised even me. I tried to remember. I went back through the months looking for it. I couldn't find it. I thought about my mother. She was a strong woman. Everybody said so, and it was true. She worked hard her whole life. She fed people, she showed up, she held things together. She died at 71, still cooking for everyone, still ironing other people's shirts, still saying, "I'm fine, don't worry about me," to anyone who asked. And nobody worried about her, not because they were cruel, because she had told them not to. Because women like us women who learned early that love means giving, that worth means usefulness, that the measure of a good woman is how little trouble she causes, we spend our whole lives training the people around us not to worry about us. And then we grow old inside the very care we taught them to withhold. I looked at the index card in my mother's handwriting propped against the backsplash. Her recipe. Her mother's recipe before that. 3 generations of women who woke before sunrise to feed everyone else first. And I thought, I don't want to be the 4th. I am 63 years old. I have 30 years left if I'm lucky, 20 if I'm not. And I have spent the last 4 of them making myself so small, so quiet, so undemanding that I have disappeared from my own life. That ends today. I don't know what today looks like. I don't know what I'm going to do or say or change. I just know that something has to be different, starting now, starting this morning, starting with this pan of cornbread that I am making in a kitchen that is mine, in a house that is mine on a street where I have lived for 34 years. I am not furniture. I am Gloria Washington, and I am still here. I cut a piece. I buttered it. I stood at the counter and I ate it slowly, tasting it the way I hadn't tasted anything in a long time. Then I put on my coat and I walked 2 houses down to Miss Odette's. Miss Odette Williams had lived on Peachtree Lane for 30 years. We had been neighbors the whole time, friendly in the easy way of people who have lived side by side long enough that their lives have quietly intertwined, borrowed cups of sugar, waves from driveways, the occasional hour on each other's porches in the good weather. But in the 4 years since Darlene's family had moved in, I had barely seen her. There was always something that needed doing, someone who needed something from me. I had stopped going places that weren't necessary. She answered the door in her house dress, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She took one look at my face and stepped back to let me in. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just said, "Come in. I'll put the kettle on." We sat at her kitchen table with our tea. Her kitchen was quiet, neat. There were African violets on the windowsill and a small framed print on the wall that said, "Nevertheless," she persisted. The morning light came in clean and steady. I looked at all of it, and I felt something loosen in my chest. "Odette," I said, "do I seem like a person who's disappearing?" She set down her mug. She looked at me with the careful, direct attention of a woman who had known me for 30 years and had no reason to be anything but honest. "Baby," she said, "you've been disappearing for 4 years. I've been waiting for you to notice." I looked at my hands around my mug. "Why didn't you say something?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because some things a woman has to see for herself. You weren't ready before. You're ready now. I can tell." "How can you tell?" "Because you walked over here," she said simply. "That's the first thing you've done for yourself in a long time." I sat with that for a while. Outside, a cardinal landed on her bird feeder and then was gone. "I don't know where to start," I said. "Yes, you do," Miss Odette said. "You've always known. You just needed to stop pretending you didn't." 3 days later, I called Patricia Holloway. Patricia was a woman I knew from church, a real estate and estate planning attorney, sharp and careful and kind in the specific way of people who have seen enough of human nature in their work to have no illusions left about it, but chose decency anyway. We had spoken at church functions over the years, but never about anything serious. I called her on a Thursday morning while Darlene and Travis were out and the kids were at school. I sat at the kitchen table with my cup of tea and I dialed her number, and when she answered, I said, "Patricia, this is Gloria Washington. I need to understand what my options are. I own a home. My daughter and her family are living in it. And I think I've been very confused for a long time about what love means and what it costs." There was a brief pause. "Come in on Monday," she said. "I'll clear my morning." Patricia's office was on the third floor of a building downtown with windows that looked out over the city. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s with natural hair going silver at the temples and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She had the calm of someone who had heard every version of every story and was never surprised but always attentive. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything. The bedroom, the radio, the rosemary, the $4,000, the $23,400, the armchair, the phone call through the open window. She listened without interrupting. She made notes. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me. "Gloria," she said, "I want to say something to you before we talk about the legal options." "All right. You came in here and said you've been confused about what love means. I don't think that's true. I think you know exactly what love is. What you've been confused about is the difference between love and surrender. Those are not the same thing. Love is a choice you make freely. Surrender is what happens when you stop believing you have a choice." I sat with that for a moment. "You've been surrendering," she said, "for a long time, and it almost cost you everything. But it hasn't yet. That's why you're here." "What do I do?" I asked. She picked up her pen. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. We started with the bank accounts. Patricia helped me separate everything, my retirement funds, my savings, the household account. She drafted a formal letter documenting the $23,400 in unauthorized withdrawals and establishing a repayment arrangement with a 90-day timeline. Then we reviewed my will, which I had not updated since 2016. We rewrote it. The house on Peachtree Lane and the majority of my estate would go directly to Jordan and Lily when the time came, not through Darlene and Travis, but directly to my grandchildren. A portion would go to the community programs at my church. Finally, Patricia drafted a formal written notice requesting that Darlene and Travis establish a timeline for transitioning to independent housing with 60 days to make arrangements. "This will be hard," Patricia said, handing me the papers to review. "They'll push back. It may get loud." "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I thought about the woman in the kitchen window, the empty eyes, the gone laugh, the 4 years of small surrenders stacked so high they had buried her. "I've been getting ready for a while," I said. "I just didn't know it." He came to my room that same evening. I don't know how he knew I'd seen a lawyer. Perhaps Darlene had noticed something. Perhaps he'd seen Patricia's name in my phone. Travis was not a perceptive man, but he was an alert one in the way of someone who is always monitoring for threats to his comfort. He came in without knocking and sat down in the chair by the window, the small chair, the one I'd put there when I moved into this smaller room, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of a man who believes he is being reasonable. "Gloria," he said, "I think we need to talk before this gets out of hand." "All right," I said. "Look, we've all been under a lot of stress, and I think there may have been some miscommunications about the money, about the living situation. But there's a simple way to handle this that works for everybody." He laid it out calmly as if he were presenting a business proposal. The house in his version would be signed over to Darlene. I could continue living there. They would take care of me. The money would be considered forgiven as a gift, which it had always been in his understanding. Everything would be simple. Everything would be fine. "And if I don't," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said something he had not meant to say. I could see it the instant it left his mouth, the slight shift in his expression that meant he had given away more than he intended. Darlene has already been talking to a real estate attorney since last January. She wanted to make sure the family was protected in case. He stopped. In case what, Travis? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Last January, 18 months ago, before the bank statements, before the armchair, before the dinner party where Darlene had smiled at her friends and made me disappear, before any of the things that had finally made me see clearly, Darlene had already been making plans, had already been sitting across a desk from an attorney talking about my house, my estate, my case, not out of desperation, not as a last resort, as a strategy. I looked at Travis sitting in my chair in my room in my house, and I felt something settle into place inside me with the finality of a key turning in a lock. "Get out of my room," I said, quietly, clearly, without a single tremor. He stood. He had more to say, I could see it, but something in my face stopped him. He walked to the door. "You're making a mistake, Gloria." "Maybe," I said, "but it's mine to make." I sat still for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia. "Patricia," I said when she answered. "They just showed me exactly who they are. I'd like to move faster. I'll have everything ready by Friday," she said. "My bedroom door," though I had stopped thinking of it that way a long time ago. "Come in," she said. She was sitting on this bed with her phone. She looked up when I entered, and something in her face changed, a slight tightening, a readiness for conflict. She had talked to Travis. She knew something was coming. I came in. I sat down in the chair near the window, the chair I had once sat in every morning to watch the light come up over the garden before I had moved to the smaller room before all of it. I sat down in it like I still had the right to, because I did. "Darlene," I said, "I need you to listen to me, not as someone who's fighting you, not as your enemy, as your mother." "Can you do that?" She said nothing, but she put her phone down. "I have loved you every single day of your life, every single one. I want you to know that before I say anything else, because I need it to be the ground we're standing on." She looked at her hands. "I worked double shifts the summer you were 14 so you could go to dance camp. I ate cereal for dinner for a month your junior year of high school so you could have the prom dress you wanted, the blue one, the one with the beading at the neck. I sat in that delivery room with you for 11 hours when Jordan was born because you were frightened and Travis had gone white as a sheet and you needed someone who wasn't going to fall apart. I know," she said very quietly. "I'm not telling you those things so you'll feel guilty. I'm telling you so you understand I did all of it because I wanted to, because you were my whole heart, because loving you was the thing I was most certain of in my entire life. But somewhere between then and now, I said you stopped seeing me, and I let you. Because I thought that was what love required, making yourself small so the people you love have more room. I thought if I just gave enough, asked for little enough, caused little enough trouble, I thought that was how I kept you." Darlene's eyes were bright. "I was wrong," I said. "And I think if you sit quietly enough with yourself, you know I was wrong. I think you've known for a while." A tear ran down her face. She didn't wipe it. "I'm not throwing you out," I said. "I want you to hear that clearly. I am not your enemy, and I am not punishing you. But I am taking my life back. I am taking back this house, and this account, and this name, and this voice, all the things I handed over piece by piece, because I thought love asked me to." I stood up. "If you love me even a little of what I know is still in you, you'll let me. And maybe on the other side of this, we'll find our way back to each other. I hope so. Lord, I hope so." I walked to the door. "Mom," Darlene said. I turned. Her face was the face of someone who has been handed a mirror and is not entirely ready for what they see in it. "I know," I said. "Me too." 2 days before Darlene and Travis were scheduled to move out, Jordan knocked on my door. He was 15 now, taller than me by nearly a head, voice settled into something low and certain, but with his father's habit of standing slightly sideways when he was uncertain of his welcome. He stood in my doorway holding something wrapped in a cloth grocery bag. "Grandma," he said, "can I come in?" Always, I said. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed the way he used to when he was small, and would come find me after a bad dream. He held the grocery bag in his lap. I heard what happened, he said. With the chair, the blue one. I looked at him. I was little when you got it, but I remember it. You used to sit in it and read to us. You'd let me and Lily climb on the arms, and you'd pretend to be annoyed, but you never actually made us get down. I remembered. Jordan at 6, Lily at 2, both of them draped across the armrests like small, satisfied cats. He held out the grocery bag. Inside was his phone open to a photograph. It was the armchair, the navy blue one. Taken from across the room, slightly blurry the way phone photos are when the light is low, Jordan must have taken it quietly without anyone noticing. The chair was by the window in the afternoon light, with a library book I'd been reading left open on the cushion. It looked like exactly what it had been, a place where a person lived. I couldn't get it back, he said. I looked up where Dad sold it, but the people already got rid of it. I'm sorry. He had sent the photo to my number. It was already in my phone. I thought maybe you'd want to remember it, he said, since you couldn't keep the real one. I sat with the phone in my hands, and I looked at that photograph for a long moment. Then I looked at my grandson. This boy I had held as an infant, driven to school, made cornbread for, worried over, loved, in all the unspectacular daily ways that make up the real substance of a life. This boy who at 15 had thought to do the thing that not one adult in that house had thought to do, to see what had been taken from me, and to try in the only way available to him to give it back. Jordan, I said, you are so much more than you know. He ducked his head the way teenage boys do when they've been seen clearly and don't quite know what to do with it. I opened my arms and he leaned into them. This boy who was almost a man, and I held him the way I had held him in the hospital the day he was born, when he was 7 pounds and furious and new. Thank you, I said into his shoulder. I love you, Grandma, he said, and he meant it with his whole uncomplicated heart. In the 60 days between the formal notice and the day Darlene and her family moved out, I did not spend my time in conflict. There was some conflict, raised voices, slammed doors, phone calls from relatives who had heard Darlene's version of events and called to tell me I was being selfish, being cruel, being a woman who would die alone and deserve it. I let those calls come. I let people say what they needed to say. And then I went back to the work of remembering who I was. I found the rosemary seeds I had ordered online and never gotten around to planting. I started them in a small tray on the windowsill of my room, the small room, the borrowed room, the room I would soon be leaving for the one that had always been mine. I watered them every morning and watched for the first signs of green. I found the keyboards I had bought years ago to practice piano, a hobby I had taken up after Ronald died, and then quietly abandoned when Darlene's family moved in and there wasn't space, wasn't time, wasn't quiet enough. I set it up in the corner of my room. The first time I sat down and played, my fingers stumbled. Muscle memory is a slow thing to recover, but it came back a little each day the way things come back when you give them room. I called Patricia on a Tuesday and confirmed that everything was in order. The accounts were separated. The will was updated. Jordan and Lily would be provided for directly without intermediaries. The house on Peachtree Lane, every square foot of it, every scratched floorboard and stuck front door and tilted back porch, was legally and completely and without any possibility of dispute mine. I went to the consignment shop on a Saturday morning, and I spent a long time in the furniture section. I didn't find another navy blue armchair. I wasn't looking for one exactly. What I found was a high-backed chair in deep green velvet, slightly formal, a little dramatic, not the kind of thing I would have chosen before. I chose it now. The delivery men brought it on a Thursday and set it by the front window in the place where the old one had been. I sat down in it. I looked out at Peachtree Lane. A woman was walking a dog. 2 kids were on bikes. The dogwood at the end of the driveway was beginning to show its first white blooms. I reached over and turned on the radio. I found my gospel station. Mahalia Jackson came on in the middle of a song, her voice filling the room like light fills a room when you finally open the curtains. I sat in my new chair in my own house and I listened, and for the first time in 4 years, the morning felt like mine. They left on a Saturday in May. I had not planned to watch them go. I thought I would stay in my room or in the garden or somewhere that wasn't the front of the house where I would have to stand and witness the leaving and feel all the complicated things I knew I would feel. I thought it would be easier not to see it. But when I heard Travis's truck in the driveway and the sounds of boxes being carried out, I found myself moving toward the front door anyway. Not because I wanted to make it harder, because they were still my family, and I could not let them go without standing in the same air as them one last time. Travis loaded the truck in silence. He did not look at me. I did not try to make him. "I'll see you soon," I told her. "That's a promise." She pulled back and looked at me with her serious eyes, and nodded once like we had made a binding agreement, which we had. Jordan shook my hand, that formal teenage handshake that boys use when they are trying to be men, and then changed his mind and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than he probably intended. I felt the length of him against me, this almost man who had once been 7 pounds and furious in a hospital room, and I thought whatever happens, this one is going to be all right. Then there was Darlene. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps. She was wearing her good sunglasses, the ones she wore when she didn't want people to see her eyes, and she had her arms crossed in front of her, which was a thing she had done since she was a little girl, when she didn't know what to do with her hands. We looked at each other for a moment. There was so much that could have been said. There was so much that probably eventually would be said in weeks or months or years, in phone calls, and perhaps in rooms with a therapist between us, in the slow, patient work of 2 people trying to find their way back to each other across the distance that truth-telling creates. But right now, in the May morning with the dogwood blooming white at the end of the driveway, there was only this. "Mom," she started. "I know, baby," I said. "Me too." Her chin moved. She pressed her lips together. Then she nodded once and turned and got into the truck. I stood on the porch and I watched them drive away. I stood there for a while after the truck had turned the corner, and there was nothing left to watch. The street was quiet. A mockingbird started up somewhere in the oak tree across the road. The air smelled like cut grass and something sweet I couldn't name. Then I went inside. I stood in the front hallway for a moment. The house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 4 years. Not the silence of absence, not the hollow, echoless quiet of a place where nothing lives. This was a different silence. Fuller. The way a room feels when all the furniture is finally arranged the right way, and you stand in the doorway and think, yes, that's it. That's how it should be. I walked from room to room, the living room first. My green velvet chair sat by the window in the morning light, unhurried and permanent. I ran my hand across the back of it as I passed. The dining room. The table was clear. No stacked mail, no Lily's art projects, no Travis's tools waiting to be put away. Just the table where Ronald had held my hands, where I had eaten birthday dinners alone, where I had pushed aside other people's things to make room for myself. I set nothing on it. I left it clear. The master bedroom. I stood in the doorway for a moment. It still held the faint trace of Darlene's perfume, something expensive and floral she'd started wearing in the last few years. The bed was unmade sheets tangled in the hurry of leaving. The curtains they'd hung gray modern, not what I would have chosen, still covered the windows. I walked to the window and opened it wide. Then I pulled the gray curtains down. Carefully, the rings one by one. I set them in a pile on the floor. It was the same light I had woken to for 30 years in this room, coming in at that particular angle, falling across the floorboards in that particular way. I had forgotten it. Or not forgotten exactly. I had not been in this room to see it. I stood in it for a moment, just stood in it the way you stand in warm water when you first step in and let your body remember what warmth is. Then I went to the small room at the end of the hall, my room these past 4 years, and I carried Ronald's photograph and my mirror and the small tray of rosemary seedlings on the windowsill back to where they belonged. Downstairs, I went to the kitchen. I got out my mother's index card, propped it against the backsplash where it always lived, and I started the cornbread. I reached over and turned on the radio. I found the gospel station without searching. My hand went to it the way hands go to things they have always known. Mahalia Jackson was not playing this morning. It was a choir full and enormous, a Sunday morning sound that filled every corner of the kitchen and then kept going, filling the hallway and the living room and the stairs and all the empty open rooms above. I stood at the counter and I listened, and I felt the music move through me the way it used to, the way it had before I had stopped letting myself have things. I made a pot of coffee, a full pot, the kind you make when you're not rushing, when you have time, and I poured a cup and I carried it to the green velvet chair by the front window. I sat down. Outside Peachtree Lane was waking up. A neighbor walked past with her dog. The mail truck moved slowly down the block. The dogwood at the end of the driveway was in full bloom, white flowers like small cupped hands open to the morning. In the corner of the garden, just visible from where I sat, the rosemary seedlings were in their tray on the potting bench. 4 inches tall, fragile still, but alive and growing the way things grow when you give them room and light and enough time. I held my coffee cup in both hands. I took a sip, and it tasted right. Not different. Not better exactly than coffee had tasted before. Just right. The way things taste when you are fully present in the moment of tasting them, when you are not half somewhere else, not managing something, not making yourself smaller to fit the available space. Just right. I don't know when exactly I came back to myself. I know it wasn't a single moment. It was more like a long road that I had been walking without knowing I was on it. And then one morning I looked up and recognized where I was. I was home. Not the house, though. The house was mine again, too, every stuck door and tilted porch and scratched floorboard of it. But home in the older sense. The one that lives inside you. The one that nobody can sell out from under you, or move you out of, or slowly, quietly take apart piece by piece. I was home in myself, and the coffee tasted right, and the choir was singing, and the dogwood was in bloom, and that was enough. That was it, turned out everything. The letter from Patricia arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Darlene and Travis moved out. It was not a dramatic document. It was clean and precise and written in the careful language of the law, which does not deal in feelings but in facts. And the facts it contained were these. The bank accounts were fully separated and secured. The written record of the $23,400 had been formally established with a repayment schedule of Darlene's agreement. The will had been updated and witnessed and filed. Jordan and Lily Washington were named as direct beneficiaries of the estate. The house at Peachtree Lane, Atlanta, Georgia, every room, every scratched floorboard, every stuck door, the back porch that tilted slightly to the left, because Ronald had always meant to fix it, was in the eyes of the law and in every other way that mattered the sole and uncontested property of Gloria May Washington. I read the letter at the kitchen table with my coffee. Then I folded it carefully and held it in my hands for a moment. I thought of Ronald. I thought of that Thursday afternoon in 1989 when we sat on the bare floor of this empty house with cold fried chicken in a paper bag and talked about everything we were going to do. I thought of how he'd said, "This is ours, Gloria," quiet and certain like something sacred. Still ours, Ronald, I thought. Still mine. I set the letter on the table next to my coffee cup, and I went to start dinner. 6 weeks after they moved out, my phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the garden. The rosemary was doing well now, 6 inches, putting out new growth, beginning to spread the way rosemary does when it finds its footing. I had been on my knees pulling weeds from around the tomato beds, the good honest work of it, dirt under my fingernails, sun on my shoulders. I saw Darlene's name on the screen, and I sat back on my heels and I breathed for a moment before answering. "Mom?" Her voice was different. Not the voice she'd been using these past years, the efficient, slightly impatient voice of a woman managing too many things and treating her mother as one of them. This was older, quieter, The voice she'd had when she was young and something had happened and she needed to talk to me for real. "I've been talking to someone," she said. "A therapist. I started going about a month ago. I didn't say anything. I waited. She asked me in our second session to describe my mother, and I talked for almost the whole hour about you, about everything you did when I was growing up, everything you gave up, everything I took for granted." The garden was very still around me. A bee moved through the tomato plants. The rosemary lifted slightly in a small wind. At the end of the session, Darlene said she asked me, "How did your mother make you feel when you were little?" She stopped, and I said safe. She always made me feel safe, like nothing that bad could happen because she was there. I closed my eyes, and she said, "When was the last time you made her feel that way?" "Then..." "Mom," Darlene said. Her voice broke slightly on the word, the way it does when someone is trying to hold themselves together and not entirely succeeding. I couldn't answer that question. I sat in the garden with the phone against my ear and the dirt on my hands and the rosemary growing beside me, and I let the truth of what she'd said settle into me slowly, the way water settles into dry ground. She wasn't asking to come back. She wasn't asking for forgiveness on a timeline or a return to the way things were. She was just telling me the truth. Maybe for the first time in a long time. Maybe for the first time in the way it needed to be told. "Baby," I said when I trusted my voice. "That's a good start." She let out a breath, something between a laugh and a sob. "I love you, Mom. I love you too," I said. "I always have. That was never the question." We stayed on the line for another minute, not saying much, just being in the same space the way we hadn't been in a long time. Then we said goodbye, and I set the phone down in the dirt beside me, and I sat in my garden in the afternoon light, and I let myself feel all of it, the grief and the relief and the cautious, fragile, real thing that was beginning to grow between us again like rosemary after a hard season. Not fixed, not finished, but alive. And alive was enough to work with. I want to tell you something before we go. If you've been sitting with this story and something in it felt familiar, if you recognize the radio station or the birthday, no one remembered, or the chair that was sold without asking if you knew the feeling of saying good morning to someone in your own home and being walked past like a piece of furniture, I want you to hear this. What happened to Gloria is not a story about a bad daughter. It's not a story about ingratitude or greed, though those things were present. It's a story about what happens when a woman spends so long making herself small that the people around her forget she ever took up space, and about what it costs and what it takes to remember that she did. Gloria didn't find herself in a dramatic moment. There was no single confrontation, no one speech that fixed everything. She found herself in a kitchen at 5 a.m. with flour on her hands and a radio playing the wrong station, looking at a woman in a dark window and deciding quietly, firmly, without fanfare, that the woman deserved to be there. That's where it starts. Not in a courtroom, not in a fight, not in the moment when you finally say the hard thing to the person who needs to hear it. In the small, private moment when you tell yourself the truth. Ronald used to say that Gloria loved people by feeding them. He said it like it was her great gift, and it was. But the thing about feeding people, the thing Gloria had to learn at 63 years old in a kitchen on Peachtree Lane, is that you cannot feed anyone anything worth having if you have starved yourself down to nothing. You have to feed yourself first, not instead of the people you love, not in spite of them. First, because you are not furniture. You are not background. You are not the woman who stands at the edge of the photograph so someone else can have the center. You are the center. You always were. It took Gloria a little while to remember that, but she remembered. And so can you.